People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
Hey folks, welcome to a special episode of The Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. On this episode, it is the return of Clark Collis. He wrote You've Got Red on You, all about the making of Shaun of the Dead. Now he's back with a incredibly ambitious book called Screaming and Conjuring, The Resurrection and Unstoppable Rise of the Modern Horror Movie. It is a trip through the horror genre for the last, say, 25 years, that sweet spot between when Scream came out and then the Conjuring movie started, and a whole lot more. It is a just wild ride that he takes you on. Goes before Scream, of course, and goes after the Conjuring movies, and talks about a whole lot of stuff that, as you hear this interview, your mind will just start racing with all of the other titles that came out during that wonderful time. Thank you so much for listening. Definitely pick up Screaming and Conjuring, and I hope you enjoy this interview. Clark Collis, thank you so much for coming back on the show. I always appreciate talking with you. I had such a fun time talking about You've Got Red on You, and I'm super excited to talk about Screaming and Conjuring. So when I saw the title of the book, wasn't exactly sure what it was about, but I kind of had an inkling. How did you approach this topic, and what inspired this book?
So it is a book that is essentially a history of the modern horror movie, which starts with Scream in 1996 and ends with The Conjuring in 2013. Although there is an epilogue that sort of canters through the last 10 years, which proved to be a pretty busy 10 years. I just felt it was a period of time in horror that hadn't really been covered before in this particular way. I look at essentially the different waves of horror that arrived during that time. So obviously following Scream, you had a lot of teen horror, teen slashers essentially. And then that was followed by both the short-lived craze for J-horror and the rather longer-lived crazes for remaking every horror movie ever made. And also what became known as the torture porn sort of period. Plus you had the French Extreme, you had influences from abroad. Essentially the book is very US and to some degree UK focused, but primarily US. And then that also led to the start of the sort of supernatural, both found footage, the enthusiasm for found footage movies and for supernatural horror, which began with Paranormal Activity, and then Insidious, and then ultimately The Conjuring. And I think there had been books about the Scream franchise, for example, and torture porn and J-horror, and I just thought it would be interesting to me, certainly, and hopefully to readers, to weave together a tale. I could see the story in my mind, the way that one wave or one batch of filmmakers inspired the next, sort of positively or negatively. So you have Scream inspiring all the teen slashers, but then, after 2 or 3 years of that, you had the onslaught of, as I said, quote unquote, torture porn movies, which to some degree was a reaction to that. I interviewed Rob Zombie, and he was like, I was never going to make a Scream or a I Know What You Did Last Summer or an Urban Legends. It was always going to be, my influences were always going to be from the 70s, essentially. And then he went on to make House of Thousand Corpses and The Devil's Reject. So that was in my mind. Originally, I pitched my wonderful publisher, Matthew, at 1984 Publishing, doing a book that kind of described the creation of 10 or so franchises from the period, because starting with Scream in 1996, you do have this new wave of franchises, because the previous franchises of the 80s, your Halloweens and your Nightmare on Elm Streets, run out of gas a bit by the mid 90s and then were replaced by Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Saw, obviously, Hostel, and then leading into Paranormal Activity and Insidious and The Conjuring. So I suggested picking 10 franchises and looking at that. Matthew made the astute observation, that's all well and good, but if somebody doesn't, for example, the Saw movies, and that's a whole chapter they're just going to skip. So maybe it would be best to make it a little bit more palatable to those people to weave all the stories together, which I think he was 100% right, and I'm happy with the way that it turned out.
I'm surprised you survived writing a book like this, because it just seems to continue to go down the rabbit hole every single page I turn or flip through virtually these days. But it was just amazing to have you talking about Scream, and then you kind of dip back into like, well, here's more about Wes Craven, and here's more about John Carpenter, here's more about slashers, and just build and build and build and just take me through this. And you were such a good host to take me through this entire journey.
The tension was, I wanted it to be comprehensive, but I also didn't want to basically to just be a list of movies. I do not tell the story of every horror movie released during this period, but I do have a stab at telling the stories behind the most popular, the most influential, and on occasion just stories that amused me to tell. Like, I didn't intend to devote a section to the film Dracula 2000, of which I had no memory whatsoever, to be honest with you, even though it was quite a popular film. But then I interviewed the lovely and very talented Patrick Lussier, who was Wes Craven's longtime editor, but also directed a bunch of films, including, it was the second film, actually, Dracula 2000, and he related the story of how in, I guess, February 2000, Bob Weinstein said, okay, I want you to make a film called Dracula 2000. This is Bob Weinstein, obviously the brother of Harvey Weinstein and also the head of Dimension Films. He said, would you be interested in making a film called Dracula 2000? This is in February, but it has to be out by December of that year. So he had 9 months to do it. And even films are made within a 9-month period, but it's usually means that at the start of that 9-month period, they at least have a script or some notion of what this film is going to be about. And even then, it's a hell of a race. And Patrick walked me through that experience. And then I was like, I've got all this material. It's a fascinating story. And even though, I think it's not a film a lot of people remember, I kind of want to stick that in. The funny ending to that story is that Bob Weinstein was obsessed with the idea that it had to come out in 2000 because it was called Dracula 2000. But it being 2000 is not really essential to the film. It's not like all that many people saying, Dracula's alive in the year 2000. And that doesn't really happen all that much. And so in foreign territories, it was actually released in 2001. And in those territories, it was retitled Dracula 2001, which seemed like a very easy fix, to be honest with you.
I was surprised at just how many people you talked to for this one. Do you have any count of how many interviews you had to do for this?
I interviewed about 50 people, specifically for this book. I spent 18 years as a senior writer at Entertainment Weekly magazine, and during that period, because it was the period where we really started going online, I had the opportunity to interview all sorts of people about all sorts of horror folks about their films, and so some of it was old material. The strange thing was sometimes I'd be like, I wish I'd spoken to such and such about this film. And then I would just do a search of my documents on my computer and realize that I had indeed spoken to such and such about that film. Everyone in Entertainment Weekly was speaking to a lot of people during the 2000s. I did about 50 reviews specifically for the book. And then I have no idea, probably included quotes from 50 more people that I'd interviewed before. And then, frankly, I was in London and I went to the BFI, the British Film Institute, and they've got a wonderful library, and they have 2 rows of bound Fangoria magazines. And so I spent 2 months at the BFI in London going through every issue of Fangoria from that period. And it really, I've always loved Fangoria. but I have to say, boy, like they really covered horror. I mean, they and continue to do. But like, I would like, there are so many films that, like I say, people might not remember that they would have devoted a story to the production, then another article in a different issue, maybe to the effects, and yeah, that was a pretty fun couple of months. But it took a long time to crank through 17 years worth of what was then like it was out every single month. I like the writing process. So I like interviewing people and writing. And I think some people, if they decide to write this kind of history, would be like, I'm going to get all the DVDs and I'm going to spend 3 months watching the DVDs. And I certainly did spend a lot of time watching the DVDs, but I like to get on with it. Having said which, if people who are active horror fans during the 2000s or any kind of film fan will be aware that if you get those DVDs, like often there's 2 or 3 or 4 commentaries, like an Eli Roth film that might have like 7 different commentaries. And that's another, again, I'm not suggesting that's hard labor, but like the Hostel DVD or the Cabin Fever DVD, I'm, sitting down and listening to all of that because even though I interviewed Eli, like you never know what kind of little factoid is going to spring up during the commentary. And also those people's memories now are a lot hazier than have gotten hazy over time. So it's fantastic to listen to commentaries that were made when the blood on the fake corpses is still wet pretty much. This book is about 450 pages long and it literally couldn't be any longer because you need to physically bind this thing. Although after I finished it, I realized that Barbara Streisand's autobiography was 900 pages. And I did almost call up my publisher and be like, wait, why did this thing have to be, like, quote unquote, only 450 pages? Couldn't it have been longer? So I'd interview, like, Greg Nicotero, who I interviewed before, but he's mostly known, I guess, as a special makeup effects wizard. He co-founded KNB. His career goes all the way back to Evil Dead 2. And then over time, he's become like a second unit director. He's one of the main creative forces behind The Walking Dead, which is probably now what he is most famous for. But he's worked on pretty much, like, he's worked on dozens of horror movies. And so I interviewed him, and I spoke to him about the 10 most prominent horror films from the era that he worked on, from The Mist to Jennifer's Body to Drag Me to Hell to on and on. And so I'd interview him, and then I'd get up the next morning and transcribe the interview. And that's the best bit. I always think it's like when a sailor puts a net into the sea and then pulls it in, and then you see what fish you got. And that's, I mean, a lot of people use transcribing services, but I like to transcribe myself because it's like, this is what I got. Because when you're interviewing somebody, especially if you're interviewing someone about lots of different movies, you're not always really taking in what they're saying necessarily, or you need to be a better interviewer than I am to do that. You're thinking, what's the next question going to be? What's the next film going to be? Because there's always a time issue. And so I would get all these great quotes, say from Craig Nicotero, and then I would go into the text and just add them without really, and then, so this would happen day after day with different interviewees. And I wasn't really that worried about how big the book was getting until I woke up one day and realized that it was like 80,000 words longer than it could be, really, that it physically could be. And to those who don't know, like 80,000 words is like 200 pages. Basically, I was panic stricken because time was grinding on, the deadline was getting close, and this thing was now like a book more than it should be, really. And so then I had to go in, and I'm pretty good at cutting my own work. I usually find that if I leave something for a week and go back to it, then I'm like, what is half of this nonsense you've written like a week ago? So that was fine in the end, but yeah, that was something. But it's good when you've got too much material. And I always think that perhaps if you boil something down, as I had to do, from 250,000 words to 150,000 words, then hopefully people, even though it's not there, people can still sense the heft that was there. The sort of, that you still get almost like a physical feeling of a hopefully well-made, or at least extremely sturdy antique desk or something.
Were there any movies that were new to you while you were putting this together?
There was some. Like, I've never been a fan of very extreme horror. Or rather, I don't really mind very extreme horror. I guess what I don't really like is films that I'm not even sure are horror movies yet are very extreme. And I had never seen Lars von Trier's Antichrist, for instance, which I guess is technical horror. And I should say that I like quite a lot of Lars von Trier's filmography. He did a wonderful 2-season show set in a hospital, in like the maddest hospital that ever existed, called The Kingdom. And I remember going to a cinema and watching all of the second season in one day. But I'd never seen Antichrist because I think I'd read reviews and was aware that it was a bit of a tough watch. And I watched it, and it's artistic, certainly. But I was like, oh, this is no fun. And I'm glad that I hadn't seen it before. There was stuff that I felt that I probably wouldn't be writing about at length, but I felt I needed to check out to sort of make sure that I shouldn't be writing about it at length, or to understand its position in the context of horror. And I did mention Antichrist and a couple of other extreme horror movies, but then did a section on The Human Centipede, which in its own way is equally grotesque as Antichrist, but is very much more of a traditional horror movie. And there was an odd period of time in Entertainment Weekly when one of my jobs was basically being the Human Centipede correspondent, because it was something of a theatrical success. But what really became popular was the idea of stitching people together. And so it was referenced on 30 Rock and The Colbert Show and all of these TV shows. And I had like lunch with Tom Six, the director, and the cast of Human Centipede 2 at a very nice steak restaurant in Midtown. So I had all this stuff on the Human Centipede, which I thought was of interest. And yeah, there's definitely some sort of smaller movements of the era where I'm like, these are the 3 or 4 films of importance, and let's look particularly at this one movie.
Reading the book, it feels like you have seen everything. So I was surprised that there were things that you hadn't seen before.
Yeah, there were 1 or 2 that I'd avoided. And I think there's just stuff that I had seen and then frankly could not remember anything about, which isn't necessarily a diss in their quality. But for example, Patrick Lussier, who I was talking about earlier, directing Dracula 2000, later directed My Bloody Valentine 3D, remake of My Bloody Valentine, that I definitely saw, but didn't really have much memory of. And so I rewatched that. And I was like, this is a lot of fun. This is a lot of fun. It's interesting that I think when you go to the cinema, you always want it to be the best film in the world. And then when it's not, you're like, oh, okay, that was all right. But I think from a perspective of 20 years, it's amazing how many films that I probably didn't regard that highly at the time, I'm like, this is fun. This is just flat out fun. If this turned up today, then I would really enjoy it. What I thought would happen is I would watch a lot of horror films from the era, and they just wouldn't have aged. And certainly there's some, if you go back, especially to the early 2000s, when it's that period of Maxim magazine being very popular, The Man Show and all of that stuff, there's certainly some language in some of the films which hasn't aged necessarily well in terms of slurs and this and that. But with regards, apart from that, I was surprised how many of those films still stand up. I am afraid to admit that I do not have a big TV setup. You would think that I would have one of those theaters and big comfy armchair and a popcorn machine, but no, I just watch everything on the same old crappy computer that I'm speaking with you on. But I would put on like The Descent, for instance, Neil Marshall's tale of spelunkers who meet monsters in an Appalachian cave system. And I'm really hobbling the film's chances of frightening me by watching it on my tiny little computer. And that thing's scary as hell in any format, I have to say. And it's as scary now, really, as it was 20 years ago. And again, films were either as good as I remembered or had improved in my mind through time, basically.
it's always fascinating how the movies inform themselves versus the outside factors of, world politics or policy or, social movements, those kind of things. It's always so interesting to see how that balance comes by and how sometimes films just completely miss when it comes to where they should have been heading and where they ended up going to. And just like this was not very successful just because of times have changed, but the filmmakers didn't seem to realize that.
Yeah, again and again, it's like any sort of type of industry. So many people would tell me that they had trouble getting their film financed because it wasn't similar to the film that 3 days ago had just opened at the box office. I interviewed Michael Dougherty, who directed film Trick or Treat, and then later went on to direct one of the wildly successful Godzilla movies. But Trick or Treat was his first. It was his directorial debut. He was trying to get finance for it. And for those who haven't seen it, it's got essentially an anthology horror movie, but the stories are woven together. But you've got werewolves and zombies and a serial killer, but it's not like a teen serial killer thing. And he was trying to sell this in 2000 and was repeatedly told, no one gives a crap about like vampires or werewolves or anything that you're talking about. All people want teen slashers. And Michael was thinking to himself, but they're not going to want teen slashers by the time we've made this film, because that'll be in 2 years' time. And by that point, they'll have had 6 years of teen slashers, and people will no longer want to see those films, which he was absolutely proven correct. And again, there are so many stories. The book starts with a story told to me by Don Coscarelli, the writer-director of Phantasm, created the Phantasm franchise, and later went on to direct Bubba Hotep, and John dies at the end. But in the early 90s, was trying to get an adaptation of a Joe Lansdale zombie western off the ground, which you would actually think that's a fantastic mix of stuff. And he sent it out to studios, and he was like, even New Line, which was like the sort of house of horror at the time, sent a note back saying no one will ever want to see a zombie movie, basically. So then he went back and, I think, according to him, crossed out all references to zombies and just put monster instead. But who's to say? Because as you say, it has to be the right time. Maybe if Don had made a zombie western in the early 90s, that wouldn't have worked. But what I can tell you is that 10 years later, suddenly everybody's making zombie movies, and the zombie genre is not just the most popular horror genre in the world, but it's one of the most popular genres in the world for 10 or 15 years, and even up to today.
It's amazing too to think of just how many of these franchises that you talk about are still going. As we're talking, it's like 2 weeks after the latest Conjuring film, I think it is. It's like they have had legs for decades now, which is wild. I mean, even Final Destination just got a remake, I think, or maybe it's have you not seen Final Destination Bloodlines? That's one of that, honest to God, I that is my favorite theatrical experience of the whole year. It is absolutely what you want. If you don't like Final Destination films, that's fine. I wouldn't advise you go to see it. No, they absolutely do what you would want to do with that franchise, bearing in mind it has been away for a long time. And no, it's terrific. It's absolutely terrific. I would say I saw it after a couple of drinks at a free press screening, but people loved it. It was a general audience press screen, but it was a preview. I started writing this book about 2 years ago, and pretty soon it was always called Screaming and Conjuring. And then I came up with the sort of subtitle, which I still have to look at the cover of the book to remind myself what it is, but it's Screaming and Conjuring, the Resurrection and Unstoppable Rise of the Modern Horror Movie. But I did think, like, in the back of my head was like, what if it stops by the time this book comes out? And there was a period about 18 months ago, I don't know if you recall, when there was a clutch of movies, including like an Omen prequel and the vampire movie Abigail that came out. And there was a Sydney Sweeney supernatural movie. And they
all underperformed. Now, because they're low budget, relatively low budget horror movies, none of them were disasters. And I'm not saying they're bad. Within about 6 weeks or so, 3 horror movies came out. None of them was big hits. And people were like, maybe this is the end of horror. And I'm like, but sir, I'm writing a book about the unstoppable rise of horror. Am I going to have to change the thing? But then, of course, it comes to this year, and it's Sinners, it's Weapons, it's The Conjuring Last Rites, Final Destination Bloodlines, 28 years later, which, I mean, was only a medium-sized hit, but people were very much all for it. And yeah, I couldn't, as it turns out, fortuitously, it couldn't have worked out better for me. I will say people still either underrate or take for granted the box office success of horror. It is interesting to me that the last Conjuring movie came out and made $450 million pretty much around the world. And just went and mentioned, people were like, oh yeah, what do you expect? I'm like, what do you expect? That's like the 11th Conjuring movie in relatively quick succession. Many people would expect it not to make almost $500 million. And now I loved One Battle After Another. And I understand why people are wringing their hands over whether it's going to be a box office hit or not, or what that means for original material and so on and so forth. But I'm like, could we just spend another sentence talking about how this Conjuring movie made $500 million? And I'm not saying we should just make horror sequels all the time. Far from it, although that's what people are doing. But it's still taken for granted, I think. One of the reasons now that people can make One Battle After Another is because of the money that horror makes. The two things people go and see are horror and then rejigged versions of kids' IP from 15 years ago, essentially. Seems to be I can't remember the name. They keep on making, like, How to Train Your Dragon and so on.
Yeah, the Disney live action remakes and that whole movement that's been going on. Who did your cover art?
The cover art was done by the lovely and hugely talented Gary Pullin, a.k.a. Ghoulish Gary. If you Google him, you can see a fantastic amount of fantastic artwork. He specializes in horror-related sort of posters and whatnot. He's recently done the covers of a lot of Stephen King paperback reissues, and it was difficult to come up with a suitable image. It wasn't difficult for me because I didn't have to do it. But I know that my publisher, Matthew, and Gary and myself sat around and had a meeting. And the problem is that you want something that says horror, but we didn't really want to say what kind of horror necessarily, because it's a book that covers slashers and zombies and vampires and virus movies and everything. So if you've ever been to a marketing meeting or any kind of meeting of this sort, then you know there comes a point where someone's, yeah, but we want it to be cool. Whatever it is, this soapbox, we want people to know that it's got detergent in it, but cool. And if you've ever been to one of those meetings, you're like, what are you talking about? What does that possibly mean? But when we were having the meeting with Gary, I heard myself say, yeah, it's horror, but cool. And inwardly, I shrank in shame. But I think he managed to fulfill this stupid and extremely brief wonderfully. Yeah.
What are you working on these days?
I'm working on another book about a single film, but it's not. It hasn't been announced, and it hasn't been announced to the people who made the film yet. So I'm not really sure I'm at liberty to say too much about it, really. But I'm really enjoying researching it. It is fun writing these books where you're also embedding, framing the films within the context of what was going on, like, at the time as well, and how that impacted the way that the films were made and then released. And going back to Screaming and Conjuring, there is a lot of stuff about 9/11, and then to some degree the financial collapse, and then ultimately in the epilogue, COVID. I've made it sound like a terrible book to read. These are quite lightly touched upon, but there's no doubt that the movies of the time, and specifically horror movies, are reflective of the times in which they're made, because they can reference things that are going on in the current day without being necessarily a huge plot point. If people have seen Grindhouse, for instance, in the Planet Terror section, there's these soldiers come back from war and they bring a disease with them, and they just mention that they've just killed Osama bin Laden in a cave or whatever. I'm not being trite about the subject matter. As Robert Rodriguez said, the great thing about exploitation movies is you can rewrite the script as you go along to incorporate what's happening in the present day.
I was very glad that you had that context around these films and saw that influence. I mean, I'm just thinking now of, the Megan films and Companion and these types of films and how they're really kind of tapping into the fears over AI. And it's much easier to have a personification of AI rather than that Johnny Depp movie with the, what was that called?
Oh man, I couldn't remember the name at the time, but it's the director. It's the first and I believe last film directed by Christopher Nolan's longtime cinematographer.
Transcendence.
There you go. I always think you shouldn't name a film. I just don't think you should name a film or anything a word that people can't spell and don't know what it means. I just think it makes people, everything else, people are like, hey, do you want to go to movies? What's on? And they'll look and be like, what the hell? How do you know? I'm not going to say Transcendence out loud. You know what I mean? They'll go and see something else instead. My theory. Yeah, there was one theory that I read that I wanted to include in the book and then didn't, but I was reading a book about, I think it was a whole book of essays about Blumhouse. And there is a theory that I don't necessarily subscribe to, but that the wave of movies about ghosts in houses, so your Insidiouses and your Paranormal Activities, were partly inspired by the financial crash because they made houses and homes such a stress point and sort of the struggle to keep your house and to, by extension, cinematically defeat the ghost which is hanging around in your house. It made that sort of even more of a worry for people than it was before. You can overconnect these things, and I wasn't entirely sure about that. Although I will say, when people may remember that Drag Me to Hell, sometimes these things happen accidentally, and when Drag Me to Hell came out, which is a film which is kicked off by the lead character not giving a loan to the antagonist, essentially, who is an older Romani lady. And so the older Romani lady loses her house and then curses the lead actress. And when that premiered at Cannes in, I'm going to say 2008 or 9, they got a lot of questions about, or it was written up as like the first film of the sort of financial crash era. But in fact, Sam Raimi, who directed and co-wrote the film with his brother, it was actually like a 20-year-old script that they dug up. They had started working on it 20 years previously. But then sometimes the film just meets the moment. Saw was written long before the start of the Iraq War. And yet that is a film that very, very much, again, seemed reflective of the state of politics and diplomacy and geopolitics. And then I think was partly embraced by people because they were becoming familiar with seeing this awfulness on the news. That's a cheery thought for you.
Your enthusiasm for the material comes through in the writing, and it just makes me so excited to read about these films, even though, frankly, yeah, there are certain of these franchises where I'm just like, not really for me, like the Saw movies, but I really enjoyed reading your writing about them. And going back to the housing crisis, I mean, I actually really agree with that, and especially films like, I mean, even, Vivarium or even that Poltergeist remake, where it just feels like we have a home. We have to do what we can to protect the home, not just as the family unit, but as a financial investment. We don't want this investment to be screwed up.
No, I think you're right. I'm now beginning to wish I put it in the book. Of course, with Vivarium, what they want to do is get out of the damn house rather than stay in it. But I understand that it's still a source of stress. I'm a big fan of the Saw franchise. I think it's a miracle what they pulled off with that. But if you're making 8 movies, or whatever it was, 7 movies in 7 years, then not every decision you're going to make is going to be correct. I tell you, the thing that I'm most fascinated about with these franchises is they got locked into this idea that if there was a big hit that was franchisable, then they should make the second one the following year. Like they should only allow year to pass because they wanted to cash in, and this was particularly true with the Saw franchise. But often, the people that made the first film are like, "Yeah, good luck with that, and we're going to go off and do something else." So James Wan, who directed the first Saw movie, did not make Saw 2, and the director of the first Paranormal Activity movie did not make the second one. So again, going back to our story of Dracula 2000, once again, they've got less than a year to make this movie. I find that race to do that just incredibly interesting to research and write about. It's almost like the second movie of those franchises is almost more of a story than the first. Right now, there's so much writing on it. Yeah, so many people have so much writing on it. There was an idea with Paranormal Activity 2. Jason Blum had an idea that they should give 10 different filmmakers a very small amount of money. I can't remember if there was 10. I think they should spend $1 million giving 10 different filmmakers $100,000 each and just release the best one, which I would have loved that to have happened. But cooler heads prevailed and wiser heads, or maybe less wise heads prevailed, and they did it in a more traditional fashion.
It sounds like that Von Trier film. What was it? The 9 Challenges?
Oh, that's a great movie. That is I think about that film quite a lot. The horror movies are. I mean, there was that sort of meme or whatever a couple of years ago that men spend, I don't know what it is, 37 points in the day think about the Roman Empire. But like horror films are definitely my Roman Empire. I think about the Alien movies quite a lot, especially now we've had the TV show, and that's what I cogitate on in the bath.
Yeah, it's amazing. The Alien franchise has been with me for almost my entire life. That came out when I was pretty young and still with me today as a relatively old man. I'm just like, wow, I can't believe that this thing still has legs after all these years.
The first Alien movie is definitely one of the reasons I'm interested in horror, as was the case for so many people that I interviewed in my book. But I remember when I was about, I don't know, 9, 10, we had a very eccentric music teacher who went to see Alien and then decided to spend the next music lesson telling us the entire plot of Alien from beginning to end. And I'm like 10 years old, and I'm like a gog at this. And then I bought the novelization, and eventually somehow they must have screened it on TV and got it on video and would freeze frame the alien coming out of the egg and the chest burster scene, and then was old enough to go and see Aliens in the cinema, which is one of my favorite cinematic experiences of all time. I'm just now telling what I think some of the best stories of my book, but I interviewed Thomas Jane for my book, who is just a great guy and has certainly an interview, like he's eccentric, but like also a great storyteller. So that's super. And he was just one of those guys. I mean, when I was choosing people to interview for the book, it was often people who'd worked on several horror films, because you do get that, because it's just easier and then it's fun and they can become a recurring character. And he was in Deep Blue Sea, which I mentioned somewhat briefly, and then Dreamcatcher, which I talk about at some length, and then The Mist, which I also talk about at some length. But he just described as a kid being taken to see Alien, I think he grew up in Chicago, in one of Washington, I think it was Washington, D.C., in one of these sort of huge picture houses. And he went with his family. He was like, couldn't afford a babysitter, so my parents would just drag their kids to what would now be regarded as wildly unsuitable films at a young age. And he said, what he remembers was this woman sitting close to them at the cinema. When the chest burster scene happened, she was holding like a huge carton of Coke, like a vat of Coke. And she just jumped in her seat and the Coke went all over her. And he said that he remembered her sitting there. She didn't leave to clean herself up. She just sat there covered in sticky Coke for the remainder of the film because she was so transfixed by what was going on screen. And I love those stories as much as I love talking to people about working on War of the Worlds or something. the Tom Cruise movie.
Oh, you don't mean the Ice Cube movie?
I was partly responsible, I think it's fair to say, for promoting The Room, the Tommy Wiseau movie. Tim and Eric, the comedians, are friends of mine. And I once spent a delightful day rafting in LA is it rafting in big rubber tires with Tim and Eric and my friends. And so the first time I ever met Tim and Eric, they were sitting on these massive tires, blowing them up at a gas station, which just seemed like such a Tim and Eric image, really. Although they were just delightful and normal people. And then Eric was going to see The Room that night, and he invited me and my friends along, and he wouldn't tell us anything about it. And then we went to the Sunset 5. I think we were a bit late. Went to the Sunset 5 on Hollywood Boulevard, wherever it is, Sunset Strip. And we went in. I'd never even heard of this film. I'm now in a packed theater with 200 people throwing plastic spoons at the screen. I'm like, what the hell is this? So then I convinced Entertainment Weekly, against possibly their best judgment, that they should devote like 6 pages to this film that was terrible and no one had ever heard of. Because of my experience, Human Centipede correspondent, I then became Entertainment Weekly's The Room correspondent. And that proved to have even longer legs than the Human Centipede, because ultimately they made The Disaster Artist. So that was like a full decade of talking about so bad it's good movies, and in particularly The Room. So got a bit burned out on it, really. So I haven't gotten around to see the Ice Cube starring War of the Worlds as yet.
I doubt that they're going to have a full theatrical presentation where people, I don't know, throw computer monitors. I don't know what they would do.
Yeah, maybe not. I don't know. I also think there is a bit of me, maybe I'm just getting soft to my old age, but I just keep on thinking, well, I did make this during COVID. Like,
Though now in 2025, it feels like a whole different era. Well, Clark, thank you so much for your time. It is always so nice talking with you.
Mike, it's an absolute. I'm going to write another book just so that we can get to talk again. That's my promise / threat to you.
We can talk when you're not writing a book. It's really okay.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm a huge fan of the Projection Booth, and you're doing God's work with it. And it's such an honor to come on and talk about my own sort of humble movie history.
I'm never crying.